Story 1. The Watcher at Cold Bay. Michael Torres accepted the position as winter caretaker at the abandoned Cold Bay Naval Air Station in October of 2022. The former World War II installation sat on the Alaska Peninsula, a sprawling complex of deteriorating buildings and empty hangars facing the Bering Sea. The pay was exceptional, the solitude appealing, and Michael needed distance from his former life in Seattle. He'd spent 15 years as an architect before his divorce, and the idea of 6 months alone with his thoughts seemed therapeutic. The recruitment agency warned him about the isolation, the brutal weather, and the complete darkness that would dominate from November through January. Michael assured them he was prepared. He wasn't. The station stretched across 40 acres of windswept tundra connected by a maze of underground tunnels built to protect personnel from the howling Arctic storms. Michael's duties were simple: monitor the buildings for structural damage, maintain the backup generators, and ensure the place didn't completely fall apart before the government decided its fate. They provided him with a satellite phone, a year's worth of supplies, and a modified truck capable of handling the extreme conditions. The nearest town, also called Cold Bay, housed maybe 25 year-round residents 10 miles away, though Michael was told they kept to themselves during winter. His first month passed uneventfully. Michael established a routine, exploring different sections of the base during the limited daylight hours, reading in the evenings and maintaining detailed logs. The buildings held echoes of their military past: faded propaganda posters, rusted equipment, and empty barracks that once housed thousands of servicemen. The tunnels fascinated him most: concrete passages that connected the major structures, allowing movement regardless of weather. Some stretched for hundreds of yards, lit by emergency lighting he'd restored. Walking through them, Michael sometimes felt the weight of history, imagining young soldiers rushing through these same corridors during the war. The Watcher first appeared in early November, just as the perpetual darkness began. Michael was conducting his evening rounds, checking the eastern perimeter buildings before the latest storm arrived. He'd developed a habit of scanning the tundra with his flashlight, watching for the foxes and occasional caribou that wandered through. That night, his beam caught something at the edge of the complex, perhaps 300 yards away. A figure stood motionless in the swirling snow, humanoid in shape but wrong in proportion. Too tall, perhaps 7 feet, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Michael's breath caught in his throat. He blinked, adjusted his flashlight, but the figure remained utterly still despite the wind that buffeted everything else. He called out, his voice lost in the storm. The figure didn't respond, didn't move. Michael's rational mind offered explanations: a trick of shadows, a piece of debris, his eyes adjusting poorly to the darkness. But his instincts screamed danger. He backed toward the nearest building, keeping his light on the figure. It remained stationary, a dark silhouette against darker sky, until he reached the door and ducked inside. When he looked back, it was gone. Sleep came poorly that night. Michael lay in his quarters, listening to the storm rage against the building, telling himself he'd imagined it. Isolation played tricks on the mind. He'd read about that. 6 months alone could create hallucinations, especially in extreme environments. But when dawn's meager light finally arrived around 10 in the morning, he found tracks in the fresh snow. Not fox or caribou tracks. These were enormous footprints, vaguely humanoid but stretched and distorted, each print nearly 2 feet long. They circled the building where he'd been, then led away toward the old flight line before disappearing. The pattern repeated nightly. Michael would see the figure during his rounds, always at a distance, always motionless. Sometimes near the hangars, sometimes by the old barracks, once standing directly in the middle of the airstrip. It never came closer than 200 yards, but it was always there, watching. The footprints confirmed its presence, impossible tracks that appeared each morning despite his attempts to convince himself otherwise. He photographed them, measured them, documented everything with growing dread. The satellite phone tempted him, but what would he say? That he was being watched by something that left inhuman tracks. They'd recall him, declare him unfit, and his professional reputation would suffer. Michael had already lost so much. He couldn't afford to lose this too. By mid-November, the darkness was nearly complete, with only a dim twilight appearing for 2 hours each day. Michael's routines became increasingly rigid, a desperate attempt at maintaining sanity. He avoided windows when possible, hated the vulnerability of being silhouetted against interior lights. The tunnels became his refuge, though even there he sometimes heard sounds that shouldn't exist. Footsteps that echoed his own, breath that wasn't his, scraping sounds against the concrete walls. He started timing his rounds to avoid certain sections, creating mental maps of safe zones and areas that filled him with inexplicable dread. The encounter in the tunnel came on November 23rd. Michael was checking the generator room in the main hangar complex, traveling through the longest tunnel section. His flashlight illuminated the concrete passage ahead, emergency lights casting a sickly green glow every 50 feet. He was halfway through when his light died, not gradually but instantly, as if something had swallowed the beam. Michael froze, hand fumbling for the spare flashlight on his belt. In the darkness he heard breathing, deep, wet, resonant breaths that echoed off the walls. Not human breathing. Something larger, something that shouldn't exist in this space. The emergency lights began failing one by one, darkness advancing from both ends of the tunnel. Michael ran, terror overriding thought, his boots pounding on concrete as he fled toward the nearest exit. Behind him, the breathing grew louder, accompanied now by footsteps that matched his pace, heavy impacts that shook the tunnel floor. He could feel its presence, a mass of wrongness pursuing him through the darkness, gaining with each stride. His lungs burned, his legs screamed, but panic drove him forward. The exit door appeared ahead, and Michael hit it at full speed, bursting into the Arctic night and slamming the heavy metal door behind him. He stood in the screaming wind, gasping, waiting for the door to burst open behind him. It didn't. Minutes passed. Nothing emerged. Eventually, Michael's rational mind reasserted itself enough to check his equipment. His flashlight worked fine now, beam bright and steady. He approached the door cautiously, listened, heard nothing but wind. When he finally opened it and looked inside, the tunnel was empty. Emergency lights functioning normally, no sign of anything unusual. But his timer showed he'd been in there for 23 minutes. His memory insisted he'd been running for less than 2. Somewhere in that tunnel, 18 minutes had disappeared. The incident broke something in Michael's careful rationalization. He stopped pretending this was explainable, stopped trying to convince himself he was hallucinating. Something was here, something that existed in the spaces between rational thought. The base had history. Thousands of men had lived and died here during the war, and before that, the Alaskan natives had avoided this area, calling it cursed ground. Michael found old records in the station archives, reports from the 1940s describing unusual occurrences and personnel requesting transfers due to psychological stress. 3 soldiers had disappeared from the base during its operation, never found despite extensive searches. The official explanation was desertion, but the reports hinted at something else, carefully worded sentences that described more than they stated. December brought absolute darkness and temperatures that regularly hit 40 below zero. Michael's world contracted to survival, maintaining heat, preserving food, keeping the generators running. But the Watcher was always there, visible now in every window, reflected in every surface. It stood on the flight line each night, motionless, growing gradually closer. Michael measured the distance obsessively. 200 yards became 190, then 180. It was approaching slowly, patiently, as if it had all winter and knew Michael had nowhere to go. The storms prevented any chance of evacuation. Even the satellite phone was useless when wind speeds exceeded 90 miles per hour. He stopped sleeping in his quarters, instead creating a nest in the central communications room, a windowless space in the heart of the main building. He barricaded the door, kept emergency supplies within reach, and monitored the base's few functioning cameras. One camera faced the flight line, and Michael watched it obsessively, documenting the figure's nightly appearances. On December 15th, it stood 100 yards away. On December 20th, 75 yards. It was winning through patience, and they both knew it. Christmas arrived without acknowledgement. Michael sat in his fortified room drinking stale coffee and watching the camera feed. The figure stood 50 yards away now, clearly visible in the dim glow of the exterior lights. For the first time, Michael could see details. Impossibly long arms ending in hands with too many fingers. A head that sat wrong on its shoulders, a body that seemed to shift and writhe beneath dark covering. It stared directly at the camera, directly at him, and Michael understood with cold certainty that it knew exactly where he was, had always known, was simply following some incomprehensible rule that required this gradual approach. The satellite phone crackled to life that night, impossible considering the storm conditions. A voice emerged from the static, words in a language Michael didn't recognize, yet somehow understood. It spoke of cold and hunger, of watching and waiting, of debts owed by those who trespassed on ancient ground. The base was built on a site of significance, a place where the barriers between worlds grew thin, especially in the darkness of winter. The Watcher had always been here, would always be here, and Michael's presence was both intrusion and invitation. On December 28th, the figure stood 10 yards from the building, clearly visible through the communications room's camera feed, despite there being no direct line of sight. Michael realized then that it didn't need physical approach. It had been approaching through other dimensions, through spaces that existed perpendicular to reality. The tunnels were conduits, the darkness was a medium, and his isolation had made him vulnerable to perception. He was seeing it now, not because it had moved closer, but because his mind had been worn down enough to perceive what had always been there. The rescue helicopter arrived on January 5th, 2 weeks ahead of schedule, sent because Michael had missed his scheduled check-ins. They found him in the communications room, catatonic but alive, surrounded by pages of notes written in languages he didn't know. The camera feeds showed nothing unusual, just empty tundra and snow. Michael spent 3 weeks in an Anchorage psychiatric facility before being released to his sister's care in Portland. He never spoke about what happened at Cold Bay, never filed an official report beyond citing psychological stress. But sometimes, on winter nights, Michael wakes to see a figure standing at the foot of his bed, impossibly tall, watching with patient hunger. He knows it followed him south, or perhaps was always there, waiting for him to become aware of it. The Watcher exists in the spaces we don't see, the corners of vision, the darkness between heartbeats. And once you've seen it, truly seen it, it never really leaves. Michael Torres learned this truth in the Alaskan darkness, and he carries it with him still, a permanent passenger in his fractured perception of reality. Story 2. The last transmission from Tanana. Sarah Brightwood moved to Tanana, Alaska in August of 2023 to work as the town's only radio operator and emergency services coordinator. The village of barely 100 residents sat at the confluence of the Tanana and Yukon rivers, accessible only by plane or boat during summer, and by ice road or small aircraft during the frozen months. Sarah was 28, fresh from a bad relationship and seeking the kind of isolation that only Alaska could provide. The previous operator had retired after 30 years, and the regional native corporation that administered the village offered Sarah a salary that seemed astronomical for the work involved. She accepted immediately, packed her life into 2 duffel bags, and flew into her new home on a bouncing 6-seater plane. The radio station occupied the 2nd floor of the community center, a weathered building that also housed the volunteer fire department and village council chambers. Sarah's equipment was outdated but functional, a shortwave radio system that connected Tanana to the outside world, weather monitoring gear, and an emergency broadcast system. Her job was straightforward: maintain communication schedules with other bush communities, monitor weather conditions, coordinate emergency responses, and serve as the voice of Tanana for anyone who needed it. The villagers were welcoming but reserved, mostly Koyukon Athabaskan with a handful of white transplants like herself. They gave her space to settle in, offering help when needed but respecting her privacy. Sarah fell into her routine easily. Morning weather reports, afternoon radio checks with nearby villages, evening community announcements. She learned the rhythms of bush Alaska, the constant hum of generators, the smell of wood smoke, the way sound carried differently in extreme cold. Her small apartment above the radio station became a comfortable nest, insulated against the approaching winter. She made friends slowly, particularly with Emma, a 50-year-old Koyukon elder who ran the village store and seemed to adopt Sarah as a project. Emma taught her about the land, the river, the history of the area, and the old stories that had been passed down for generations. The winter of 2023 arrived with unusual severity. By mid-October, temperatures had dropped to 20 below and the ice formed early on the rivers. The elders talked about it being a bad winter, the kind that happened once every few decades when the land itself seemed angry. Sarah dismissed this as superstition until November, when the darkness settled in earnest and things began to change. It started with the radio signals. On November 7th, Sarah was conducting her routine evening check-in with McGrath, a larger village 90 miles to the east. The signal was clear until exactly 9 p.m. when it suddenly filled with static, and beneath the static, voices. Not the voice of the McGrath operator, but multiple voices speaking simultaneously in what sounded like Athabaskan dialects. Sarah tried adjusting frequencies, but the voices persisted, always just beneath the static, never quite clear enough to understand. After 15 minutes, they faded, and the McGrath operator came back online, asking if Sarah had experienced interference. She had. So had 6 other villages across interior Alaska, all at exactly 9 p.m. The phenomenon repeated nightly. 9 p.m. The interference arrived, voices speaking in old languages. Sarah began recording them, playing them for Emma, who grew increasingly disturbed. Some of the words were recognizable, old Koyukon terms that hadn't been commonly used in generations, words for spirits and boundaries and warnings. Emma brought in Thomas, the village's oldest resident at 83, who listened with mounting horror. He recognized some phrases, stories his grandmother had told him about the time before, when the darkness was different, alive, and hungry. He refused to translate more, insisting that some words gave power to what they described. By late November, the radio interference had evolved. The voices were clearer now, and they were speaking in English or something approximating it. They called out names describing people who had lived in the village decades ago. Sarah would hear a voice say, "James Wilkinson died February 1947, still walking the ice," followed by laughter that didn't sound human. She researched the names, finding death records that confirmed their existence. James Wilkinson had indeed died in February of 1947, drowning when he fell through river ice. Others matched similarly: deaths by exposure, accidents, disappearances. The voices began addressing Sarah directly on December 1st. "Sarah Brightwood, a voice said during the nightly interference. "Sitting in the warm room listening to the dead. Can you hear us, Sarah? We can see you." She immediately shut down the radio, hands shaking, but the voice continued through the powered-off speakers. "The darkness comes early this year. The boundaries are thin. We're coming back, Sarah. Tell them we're coming back." Emma confirmed Sarah's worst fears the next day. The old stories spoke of times when the winter darkness lasted too long, when the spirits of the dead could return to the world, drawn by the weakness of barriers between realms. It happened, in cycles, usually when winters were severe and the darkness profound. The last time was in 1918, when 17 people disappeared from interior villages in a single week, their bodies never found. The elders had performed ceremonies to strengthen the boundaries, and the disappearances stopped. But those elders were gone now, and their knowledge had died with them. The first disappearance occurred on December 8th. Marcus Hunter, a 42-year-old trapper, left his cabin 3 miles from the village to check his trap lines. His snowmobile was found running at the edge of the frozen river. No sign of Marcus except for tracks that led onto the ice and then simply stopped, as if he'd been lifted from the ground. Search parties found nothing despite 3 days of looking. The radio voices laughed that night, describing Marcus in present tense, saying he was with us now, walking in the cold. More disappeared over the following weeks. Jenny Caldwell, a teacher, David Titus, a maintenance worker. An entire family, the Johnsons, vanished from their locked home, no signs of struggle, just empty beds and running generators. Each disappearance was preceded by the radio voices calling out their names the night before. Sarah began keeping a log, warning people when the voices mentioned them, but it made no difference. Those named by the voices disappeared regardless of precautions. The village population dwindled from 100 to 83 to 71. On December 20th, the voices changed their pattern. Instead of speaking in English, they began broadcasting in perfect imitation of lost residents. Sarah would hear Marcus Hunter's voice describing his current location. Somewhere dark and cold, but not like regular cold. This goes deeper into your bones and then past them, into whatever's beneath. Followed by Jenny Caldwell discussing the things she'd seen, entities that moved through the darkness like fish through water. The voices begged for help, for rescue, but there was nowhere to rescue them from. They were simply gone, existing in some adjacent space that touched but didn't occupy the same reality. The village council met on December 22nd to decide their course. Some wanted immediate evacuation despite the extreme difficulty and danger. Others argued for staying, performing whatever ceremonies they remembered, waiting out the winter. Thomas spoke last, his voice heavy with resignation. The old protections were gone, he said. The boundaries would remain thin until the equinox in March, when the returning light would strengthen them again. But that was 3 months away, and the voices promised to take them all before then. They needed help, but who could help with this? Sarah made a decision that night. She couldn't save the village, but she could document what was happening, broadcast it to the wider world, force acknowledgement of events that would otherwise be dismissed or covered up. She began, transmitting detailed reports on every frequency she could access, describing the disappearances, playing recordings of the voice transmissions, begging for intervention. Most ignored her. Some called her crazy. But a few listened, including a researcher at the University of Alaska who specialized in traditional knowledge and unexplained phenomena. Dr. Robert Chen arrived on December 27th, flying in on the Daily Mail plane despite warnings about the danger. He was 45, Chinese-American, and obsessed with documenting things that science couldn't yet explain. Sarah showed him everything, the recordings, the logs, the patterns. Robert set up additional monitoring equipment, recording not just radio frequencies but electromagnetic readings, temperature fluctuations, even air pressure changes. His instruments detected anomalies every night at 9 p.m. Massive electromagnetic disturbances, temperature drops of 30 degrees in seconds, pressure changes that shouldn't occur without weather systems. The voices addressed Robert directly that night. "Dr. Chen," they said, "come to see the impossible. Stay long enough and you'll join us. The collection isn't complete yet." Robert remained calm, asking questions, treating the phenomenon as data to be analyzed. But Sarah could see fear in his eyes, recognition that they were dealing with something that existed outside the frameworks he used to understand reality. On January 2nd, the village population reached 53. 47 people had vanished in 2 months, and those remaining were increasingly desperate. Several families attempted to leave, driving out on the ice road despite horrific conditions. None reached the next village. Their vehicles were found abandoned mid-journey, engines running, no trace of occupants except tracks that led into the surrounding forest and disappeared. The voices described their destinations. Not death exactly, but transition into something other. Existence in spaces that bordered but didn't intersect with normal reality. Sarah's name appeared in the transmissions on January 7th. "Sarah Brightwood," the voices said. "Keeper of words, voice of the dying village. Your turn approaches. We'll take you last. Let you watch everyone else disappear first. You wanted isolation, Sarah. We'll give you the ultimate isolation, alone with us in the darkness between." She broke down then, the accumulated stress and terror overwhelming her careful composure. Robert held her while she sobbed, admitting his own fear, his inability to stop what was happening. The researcher proposed one desperate option. The traditional ceremonies were lost, but perhaps modern technology could replicate their effect. If the phenomena involved electromagnetic disturbances, maybe they could create interference, disrupt the patterns that allowed the voices to manifest. He spent 3 days rewiring Sarah's equipment, creating a system that would broadcast white noise across all frequencies at 9 p.m., hopefully blocking whatever channel the voices used. It was guesswork, desperation science, but it was all they had. January 10th arrived and Robert activated his system at 8:55 p.m. The equipment hummed with power, filling every frequency with static. 9 p.m. came and the voices tried to break through but couldn't. The static held, a wall of noise that prevented their manifestation. Temperature and electromagnetic readings remained normal. For the first time in 2 months, the nightly visitation didn't occur. The village celebrated cautiously, hoping this reprieve might last. But the voices adapted. On January 11th, they appeared at 8 p.m. instead, before Robert's system activated. On January 12th, they manifested at 7 p.m., then 6 p.m. on the 13th. They were learning, adjusting, finding ways around the barriers. Robert scrambled to expand his system to create continuous interference, but the equipment wasn't designed for sustained operation. On January 15th, it failed completely, burnt out from overuse, and the voices returned with vengeance. "Clever Dr. Chen," they said, "trying to silence us. You can't. We're not just in the radio, we're in the darkness itself, in the cold, in the isolation you sought. We're Alaska in winter, the true Alaska, the one that existed before your kind arrived. This land belongs to the darkness, and we're reclaiming it one soul at a time." The final transmission from Tanana occurred on January 21st, 2024. Sarah broadcasted herself, speaking calmly despite her terror, describing the situation for any future listeners. 32 people remained in the village, huddled together in the community center, surrounded by lights and generators, trying to hold back the inevitable. The voices now manifested constantly, not just at night, calling to residents by name, promising rest and reunion and freedom from fear. People walked out willingly now, unable to resist the summons, disappearing into the darkness like smoke dispersing in wind. "If you're hearing this," Sarah said, "understand that something exists here, something that awakens in extreme conditions. In the profound isolation and darkness of Arctic winter. The old people knew about it, created barriers that we've let crumble through neglect and disbelief. I don't know if we'll survive until the equinox, don't know if the returning light will save us. But this needs to be documented. Whatever happens here, whatever takes us, it's real. The darkness is alive in Alaska and it's hungry." The transmission ended at 11:47 p.m. No further communications emerged from Tanana. A rescue expedition reached the village on February 1st, delayed by extreme weather and bureaucratic hesitation. They found the community center empty but intact. Generators still running, lights blazing against the darkness. Sarah's apartment was undisturbed, her final log entry, dated January 21st. No bodies, no signs of struggle. Just an empty village with tracks leading from every building into the surrounding forest, where they disappeared as if the walkers had simply evaporated. Official explanations ranged from mass hysteria to coordinated hoax to tragic weather-related deaths with bodies yet to be recovered. The village was officially abandoned, buildings left to the elements, radio station powered down permanently. But sometimes, on winter nights when atmospheric conditions are right, radio operators across interior Alaska report hearing voices on certain frequencies. Transmissions from Tanana describing the darkness and the cold and the things that live in them, begging for someone to understand before it happens again. Dr. Robert Chen's body was found in April, frozen in a snowbank 20 miles from Tanana, apparently attempting to walk to safety. His equipment recorded electromagnetic signatures unlike anything previously documented, patterns that suggested intelligence and intention. His notes described the phenomena as a form of life that existed in extreme environments, predatory consciousness that fed on isolation and fear. The University of Alaska sealed his research, citing incomplete data and inconclusive results. Sarah Brightwood was never found and officially remains a missing person, one of 73 individuals who disappeared from Tanana during the winter of 2023-24, the worst unsolved mass disappearance in Alaskan history. Story 3. The Thing in the Glacier. Dr. Elena Vasquez joined the climate research team at Wrangell St. Elias National Park in June of 2023. Assigned to study glacial recession in one of Alaska's most remote wilderness areas. The team consisted of 6 scientists monitoring the rapid retreat of the Nebezna Glacier, documenting climate change impacts in real time. Elena was a glaciologist from UC Berkeley, 33 years old, brilliant and driven, with a specialty in ice core analysis that had earned her recognition in scientific circles. This was her 3rd summer in Alaska, but her first time working in the Wrangell Range, a vast expanse of mountains and ice that remained largely unexplored despite its protected status. The research station sat on a rocky outcrop overlooking the glacier's terminus, a collection of weathered buildings and scientific equipment powered by solar panels and backup generators. Elena's team members included Jack Morrison, the lead researcher at 51, gruff but fair; Amanda Chen, a meteorologist in her mid-20s with an infectious enthusiasm; Derek Sullivan, a 38-year-old geologist studying glacial geology; Rachel Foster, the team's photographer and documentarian at 43; and Tom Whitehorse, a 46-year-old Atna Athabascan guide and cultural liaison who had grown up in the region and knew the land better than any outsider ever could. Elena's first month passed in a blur of field work and analysis. The glacier was retreating at an alarming rate, revealing landscape that hadn't seen daylight in thousands of years. They documented exposed rock formations, collected ice core samples, and measured water flow from the melting ice. The work was grueling but rewarding, each day bringing new discoveries. Tom proved invaluable, navigating routes across the treacherous ice fields and sharing knowledge passed down through generations of his people. He was also the only team member who seemed uncomfortable with their work, occasionally mentioning that some things were better left buried in ice. On July 14th, Derek discovered the cave. He was surveying a newly exposed section of the glacier's face when he noticed an opening, a dark cavity that extended deep into the ancient ice. The team assembled to investigate, lowering lights and cameras into the void. The cave was massive, easily large enough to walk through, with walls of blue-white ice that appeared to be thousands of years old based on visual analysis alone. More interesting were the markings on the walls, not natural formations but deliberate carvings, symbols and figures that suggested human presence long before recorded history in the region. Tom refused to enter the cave. He stood at the entrance, face drawn with concern, insisting that the symbols were warnings, markers left by his ancestors to indicate forbidden territory. The specific designs, he explained, were protection symbols, meant to seal something away, to prevent it from returning to the surface world. The team dismissed his concerns as superstition, excited by the prospect of discovering evidence of ancient human activity in the region. Only Elena hesitated, seeing the genuine fear in Tom's eyes, but scientific curiosity ultimately overrode her caution. They entered the cave on July 16th, a full team expedition equipped with climbing gear, portable lights, and documentation equipment. The passage extended 300 yards into the glacier before opening into a vast chamber, a cavern carved into ice so old it appeared almost black. The chamber was circular, perhaps 80 feet in diameter, with a ceiling that soared 40 feet overhead. More symbols covered the walls, more complex than those at the entrance, forming intricate patterns that seemed to flow and shift in their lamplight. In the center of the chamber sat an object that shouldn't exist. It was suspended in the ice, perfectly preserved, visible through translucent frozen walls. Roughly humanoid in shape, but wrong in every proportion, the thing measured perhaps 9 feet tall, with limbs that bent in too many places. Its head was elongated, the face featuring eyes that seemed too large, a mouth that split wider than any human jaw. The skin, visible through the ice, appeared scaled or plated, with a blue-gray coloration that suggested adaptation to extreme cold. Most disturbing were the hands. Each possessed 7 fingers ending in what appeared to be retractable claws partially extended in death or dormancy. The team stood in stunned silence, trying to process what they were seeing. Rachel photographed from every angle while Derek collected ice samples from the containment chamber. Amanda took temperature readings, noting that the ice surrounding the creature was significantly colder than the rest of the cavern, as if something were actively maintaining its frozen state. Jack immediately began planning extraction procedures, talking about the scientific significance of discovering an unknown species preserved in glacial ice. Only Tom stood apart, backing toward the exit, speaking rapidly in his native language, prayers or incantations that his grandmother had taught him for protection against malevolent spirits. Elena examined the ice carefully, noting inconsistencies in its structure. The ice around the creature wasn't naturally formed, but appeared deliberately constructed, layered in patterns that suggested intentional containment. The symbols on the walls aligned with the containment structure, forming what could be interpreted as a prison or cage designed by people who possessed knowledge of ice formation beyond anything modern science attributed to ancient cultures. She voiced her concerns, suggesting they document the find but leave it undisturbed until they could consult with anthropologists and paleontologists. Jack overruled her, insisting they couldn't risk leaving such a discovery unguarded in the rapidly melting glacier. The extraction began on July 18th. Using thermal probes and careful cutting, Derek and Jack worked to free the ice block containing the creature without damaging it. The process took hours, requiring delicate precision to separate the containment structure from the surrounding glacier. Tom refused to help, instead remaining at the base camp, performing ceremonies his grandmother had taught him, burning sacred plants and speaking words in Old Atna that he said would strengthen the barriers between worlds. The rest of the team considered him superstitious at best, possibly having a mental health crisis, but they were too focused on their discovery to intervene. They successfully extracted the block by evening using a portable crane system to lower it onto a reinforced sled. The ice block measured roughly 10 feet tall, 6 feet wide, and 4 feet deep, weighing an estimated 2 tons. They secured it in a specially constructed cold storage unit at the base camp, maintaining temperatures well below zero to prevent any thaw. The plan was to transport it to Anchorage within the week for proper study in laboratory conditions. Everyone was excited, already imagining the publications, the recognition, the revolutionary implications of their discovery. Everyone except Tom, who packed his equipment that night and prepared to leave at first light. "You've made a terrible mistake," he told Elena privately, before departing. "My people have stories about things like this, beings that existed before humans that were sealed away when the world changed. The ice wasn't just preserving it, it was imprisoning it. Now you've broken the seal, weakened the barriers. It's not dead, it's dormant, waiting. When it wakes, it will remember why it was sealed away." Elena tried to convince him to stay to explain more fully, but Tom refused. He left at dawn, hiking out toward the nearest village 30 miles away, refusing radio contact, leaving the team to deal with the consequences of their actions. Elena found herself increasingly uneasy, Tom's warnings echoing in her mind despite her scientific training. She conducted her own research on the creature, taking samples through small boreholes, analyzing the ice composition, monitoring for any changes. Everything appeared stable, the thing frozen solid, no signs of life or metabolic activity. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with their situation. The changes began subtly on July 21st. Amanda noticed temperature fluctuations in the cold storage unit, drops of 5 or 10 degrees that occurred without explanation. Jack attributed it to equipment malfunction, but Elena verified that all systems were functioning normally. The creature appeared unchanged, locked in its prison of ice, but somehow it seemed different each time Elena viewed it, as if it had shifted position slightly, though no actual movement could be documented. Rachel complained of nightmares, dreams where the thing opened its 2 large eyes and looked directly at her, its mouth splitting wider to reveal rows of crystalline teeth designed for purposes she couldn't imagine. On July 24th, they discovered the ice was melting. Not the surface ice, that remained frozen solid, but the interior structure, the containment layers that held the creature. The melt pattern was wrong, proceeding from the inside out, as if the thing itself were generating heat. They lowered the storage unit temperature further, pushing their equipment to maximum capacity, but the melt continued. Derek suggested it might be a biological process, some form of suspended animation ending, the creature's metabolism reactivating after millennia of dormancy. Jack proposed cutting away the outer ice to better study the process, but Elena argued for immediate evacuation, sensing they were dealing with something beyond their understanding or control. That night, Elena heard sounds from the storage unit. She was alone, conducting late observations when scraping noises echoed from the sealed chamber. Investigation showed nothing unusual, the creature remaining motionless in its diminished ice block. But the sounds continued, rhythmic scratching that seemed to come from within the ice itself. Elena spent the rest of the night in her quarters, door barricaded, listening to those sounds carry across the base camp, wondering what they had unleashed. July 26th brought the first death. Jack entered the cold storage unit for morning observations and didn't return. When Elena and Derek went to find him, they discovered the unit door sealed from inside despite its external locks. Breaking through took 30 minutes, and by then Jack was dead, frozen solid despite the unit's temperature being well within survivable range. His face was locked in an expression of terror, hands raised defensively, body positioned as if he'd been backing away from something. The creature remained in its ice, unchanged, but the block had shrunk by half. Meltwater pooling beneath it, and in that water they found traces of biological matter that didn't match any known organism. They called for emergency evacuation, but weather had turned, trapping them for at least 3 days. Amanda moved all their supplies into the main building, sealing every entrance, setting up continuous monitoring of the storage unit via camera feeds. The creature was definitely changing now, the ice around it nearly gone, its form more clearly visible, and to Elena's horror she could see movement. Subtle flexing of those impossible fingers, slight turning of the elongated head, as if the thing were waking from an impossibly long sleep. Derek disappeared on the morning of July 27th. He'd been watching the camera feeds, tracking the creature's emergence, when the power failed momentarily. When it restored, Derek was gone. His chair overturned, coffee spilled, no signs of struggle, but no sign of Derek either. The storage unit camera showed the creature's ice prison completely melted. The thing slumped forward but clearly stirring, movements becoming more pronounced. Elena and Amanda secured themselves in the communications room, broadcasting distress signals, begging for immediate extraction regardless of weather conditions. The thing emerged that evening. They watched via cameras as it broke through the storage unit door, moving with an unsettling fluidity despite apparent centuries of immobilization. It was fully awake now, those vast eyes surveying its surroundings with clear intelligence, the mouth opening to emit sounds that weren't quite screams or words, but something between. Communication in a register and language never meant for human perception. It moved through the base systematically, exploring, learning, occasionally stopping to examine equipment or structures with obvious curiosity. Rachel's final broadcast, streamed directly to university servers, showed the thing approaching the main building. "It's not aggressive," she narrated, voice shaking but professional to the end. "It seems confused, disoriented, trying to understand where it is and what happened. I don't think it wants to hurt us. I think it's scared. But it's also ancient and powerful and completely inhuman in thought process. We're trying to communicate, to show we mean no harm, but I don't know if it can understand. If this is my last transmission, know that we discovered something incredible, something that challenges everything we thought we knew about life and history." And the feed cut out. Rescue teams reached the base on July 30th, 3 days later than planned due to continued weather problems. They found the camp deserted but intact. No signs of violence or struggle, just empty buildings and running equipment. The cold storage unit was empty, the ice completely melted, the containment structure destroyed. Jack's frozen body was found but showed signs of rapid tissue degradation, inconsistent with normal decomposition. Derek, Amanda, and Rachel were never found. Elena's research notes detailed everything up to July 26th, along with extensive analysis of the creature's biology and her growing conviction that they were dealing with something that shouldn't exist in the modern world, a remnant of Earth's deep past, when the climate was different and other forms of intelligent life might have evolved and thrived. The military sealed the area immediately, citing hazardous conditions. Official reports attributed the deaths and disappearances to equipment failure, exposure, and accidental hypothermia. All research data was classified, and the remaining team members, just Tom Whitehorse, who had left before disaster struck, were required to sign non-disclosure agreements. The Nebesna Glacier continues to retreat, revealing more of its secrets each year, but that particular section is now restricted, guarded year-round by personnel who claim to be studying wildlife, but whose actual purpose remains classified. Elena Vasquez was officially listed as missing, presumed dead, but her mother received a letter 1 year later, postmarked from somewhere in northern Canada, written in Elena's handwriting but containing only a brief message. I understand now what we found and why it was sealed away. Some things evolved alongside humanity but weren't meant to share the world with us. They were put away, imprisoned in ice, hidden in deep places when the climate changed and their time ended. But climate is changing again. The ice is melting and they're waking up. The one we found wasn't hostile, just displaced, trying to understand a world that had moved on without it. I'm trying to help it, to find others of its kind, to discover if any survived elsewhere. I'm sorry for the lies you'll be told, but I'm alive, changed, but alive. Don't look for me. Love, Elena. The letter was turned over to authorities and dismissed as a hoax or the product of a disturbed individual exploiting a tragedy. But in scientific circles, particularly among glaciologists studying rapid ice retreat in Alaska, there are quiet discussions about findings that can't be explained, about discoveries that are immediately classified, about ancient things emerging from millennia of frozen imprisonment. The ice is melting faster than predicted, and nobody knows what else might be waiting, in the depths, preserved and dormant, until the day when prison walls of frozen water finally disappear entirely, releasing beings that predate human civilization and may not be compatible with the world humanity has built. Elena's discovery was just the first. How many more remain frozen in Alaska's retreating glaciers, waiting for the ice to melt and set them free? Story 4. The Silence of Wiseman. Gregory Cole arrived in Wiseman, Alaska on March 15, 2024, looking for quiet. The tiny community of 14 year-round residents sat 60 miles north of the Arctic Circle, accessible only by a single gravel road that closed each winter, leaving the village cut off from the outside world from October through April. Gregory was a writer, 41 years old, burned out from a decade of producing commercial thrillers under intense deadline pressure. He'd rented a small cabin on the outskirts of Wiseman for 3 months, March through May, hoping the isolation would help him rediscover whatever had drawn him to writing in the first place. His publisher thought he was insane. His ex-wife thought he was having a breakdown, but Gregory didn't care. He needed silence, real silence, the kind impossible to find in the modern connected world. Wiseman was perfect for his needs, a collection of weathered cabins and trailers scattered along the Koyukuk River, population that valued privacy and self-reliance, and an atmosphere of genuine remoteness. The nearest town, Coldfoot, sat 13 miles south and wasn't much larger. Beyond that, Fairbanks was 3 hours away when the road was clear, which it wouldn't be for another month. Gregory's cabin was a one-room structure with propane heat, no running water, and electricity from a generator he'd have to run himself. The previous tenant had warned him about the isolation, the darkness, the profound quiet that some people found disturbing. Gregory assured him it was exactly what he needed. His first week was everything he'd hoped for. The silence was extraordinary, a complete absence of ambient noise that he'd never experienced. No traffic, no airplanes, no mechanical hum of civilization. Just wind, the occasional call of ravens, and the profound emptiness of Arctic wilderness in early spring. Gregory wrote morning to night, words flowing with an ease he hadn't felt in years. His novel took shape rapidly, a psychological thriller about isolation and perception, ironic considering his circumstances. He interacted minimally with other residents, friendly but distant, maintaining the solitude he'd come for. The change occurred on March 23rd, and Gregory didn't notice it immediately. He was writing in the afternoon, taking a break to make coffee, when he realized he couldn't hear his generator. He stepped outside to check on it, concerned it had failed but found it running normally, vibration evident through the housing, exhaust visible in the cold air. He simply couldn't hear it. Back inside, he tested other sounds, dropping a pot, clapping his hands, shouting. All silent. He could feel the impact of the dropped pot through the floorboards, could feel the pressure of his clapping hands, but no sound reached his ears. Panic seized him immediately. Gregory had experienced temporary hearing loss before from ear infections and concert-related damage, but nothing like this. Complete, absolute silence. He grabbed his satellite phone to call for emergency evacuation, but stopped when he noticed something odd. He could hear the phone's button beeps perfectly. He could hear his own breathing. He could hear the rustle of his jacket. But nothing external to his immediate vicinity produced sound. The generator, normally a constant background noise, remained silent. Wind that should have been howling against the cabin walls was inaudible. It wasn't that Gregory had lost his hearing. It was that the world had stopped making sound. He tested his theory methodically, walking around the cabin, noting that sounds he made were audible, but environmental sounds were not. He could hear his footsteps on his own floor, but not outside on frozen ground. He could hear his voice inside the cabin, but not when he shouted into the open air. It was as if there was an invisible boundary around his immediate space beyond which sound could not penetrate, or from which it could not emerge. Gregory's writer's mind immediately recognized the impossibility of this situation, but his empirical observations confirmed it repeatedly. Physics itself appeared to be operating differently than it should. He walked to the nearest neighbor's cabin, a quarter-mile away, belonging to Martha Henderson, a 72-year-old woman who'd lived in Wiseman for 40 years. The world outside was eerily silent. No wind noise, no ravens calling, not even the sound of his boots on snow. Martha's cabin showed signs of habitation. Smoke from her chimney, lights visible through windows. But when Gregory knocked, the impact made no sound, his knuckles connecting with wood without audio feedback. He knocked harder, eventually pounding, feeling the impacts, but hearing nothing. No response came from inside. Terror was setting in now. The deep existential dread of experiencing something fundamentally wrong with reality. Gregory tried other cabins with the same result, signs of life but no sounds, no responses to his attempts at contact. He could see people through windows, moving around their homes, going about daily activities, but they seemed unaware of his presence no matter how hard he tried to get their attention. It was as if Gregory existed in a bubble of sound while the rest of the world had gone silent, or perhaps he had gone silent to them, his attempts at communication simply not registering in their perception. Back at his cabin, Gregory tried the satellite phone again. It showed signal strength and connected to the network, but when he tried calling his emergency contacts, he heard nothing, not even ringing or connection tones. He tried texting instead, sending messages to his publisher, his ex-wife, anyone he could think of, explaining his situation, begging for help. The texts showed as delivered, but no responses came. He turned on his shortwave radio, scanning through frequencies, hearing only silence broken occasionally by strange pulses that weren't quite static, more like rhythmic breathing or heartbeats at a scale beyond human perception. Night fell early this far north, even in late March. Gregory barricaded himself in his cabin, generator running, lights on, trying to make sense of his situation. He was isolated in Wiseman by choice, but this was isolation beyond anything he'd imagined. Cut off not just by distance, but by some incomprehensible failure of physical law that prevented sound from bridging the space between him and others. He tried to rationalize it. Hallucination from isolation, carbon monoxide poisoning from the generator, some medical condition affecting his perception. But no medical condition could explain hearing his own sounds while external sounds disappeared. No hallucination could be this consistent and persistent. He spent that night documenting everything, writing detailed accounts of his experience, trying to capture the specific nature of the phenomenon. His writer's training served him well, providing structure and purpose in the face of terror. He noted that light and visual perception seemed unaffected. He could see normally, watch the sun track across the sky, observe birds flying silently overhead. Only sound was disrupted, and only sound from beyond his immediate vicinity. It was as if he existed in a pocket of functioning physics, surrounded by a world where acoustics had simply stopped working. March 24th brought a horrible realization. Gregory woke to his cabin being searingly cold, the generator silent. He'd heard it running when he fell asleep, a constant background reassurance, but now it was dead. Investigation showed it had run out of propane, the tank completely empty despite being half full yesterday. The backup tank was also empty, both drained in ways that didn't make physical sense. The propane heater inside the cabin was also dry. Gregory now had no heat in an environment where temperatures regularly dropped below zero. He made a decision to hike out to Coldfoot, 13 miles south, where he could get help or at least explanations. Gregory bundled in his cold weather gear and started walking at first light, following the road south. The hike should have taken 5 to 6 hours in good conditions. Gregory walked for what felt like hours, sun tracking overhead, burning through his physical reserves, but the landscape never changed. He'd pass a distinctive rock formation, walk for another hour, and find himself passing the same formation again. The road curved back on itself in ways it hadn't before, leading him in circles, despite him following it carefully, keeping the sun as a reference point. By what should have been afternoon, Gregory admitted defeat and turned back toward his cabin. The return journey was mercifully direct, taking perhaps an hour, the landscape cooperating in ways it hadn't before. But now his situation was desperate. No heat, no communication, trapped in an area experiencing some kind of spatial distortion. His satellite phone showed full signal, but all calls went nowhere. All text disappeared into the void, as if the communication infrastructure existed but connected to nothing. That night, without heat, Gregory nearly died. He burned furniture in his wood stove, wrapped himself in every blanket and piece of clothing he owned, and barely survived until dawn. But the ordeal brought a strange clarity. He was being kept here, isolated not just physically but through supernatural means that prevented his escape or communication. The question was why? What had he done to trigger this, or what was being done to him, and for what purpose? He found the answer in the silence itself. On March 26th, Gregory stopped trying to make noise, stopped fighting the isolation, and simply listened to the silence. In that profound quiet, he began to hear something else. Not sound exactly, but the impression of sound. Communication that existed below the threshold of normal perception. Voices, if they could be called that, speaking in registers and patterns that human hearing wasn't designed to process, but which his mind, stripped of normal acoustic input, was slowly learning to interpret. They spoke of Wiseman's history, of the land's nature, of entities that existed in the spaces between human perception. The area around Wiseman sat on a geological formation of unusual properties, rock and ice that resonated at frequencies below human hearing, creating pockets of altered reality where physical laws behaved differently. Most people never noticed because the effects were subtle, brief, easily rationalized. But Gregory had come seeking silence, seeking isolation, opening himself to perception of things normally drowned out by the constant noise of human existence. He'd achieved what he wanted, connection to something deeper than daily life, but the price was disconnection from everything else. The voices explained that he could leave, could break the isolation, but only by accepting what he'd perceived, acknowledging it as real rather than hallucination or breakdown. The world he came from demanded rational explanations, scientific frameworks, refused to accept phenomena that didn't fit established models. Gregory could return to that world, but he'd have to deny everything he'd experienced here, classify it as mental illness or environmental poisoning. Rejoin the consensus reality that had no room for pockets of altered physics. Or he could stay, continue to perceive and communicate with entities that existed in the silent spaces. Become a translator between worlds, but at the cost of his previous life and relationships. Gregory spent March 27th in contemplation, weighing his options, understanding finally the test he was undergoing. Isolation had been his choice, but he'd imagined it as temporary, a retreat before returning refreshed to normal life. This offered something different, genuine separation, existence in a space adjacent to but not quite part of human civilization. The voices weren't threatening, merely presenting options, allowing him to choose his reality. On March 28th, Gregory made his decision. He would stay, would learn to communicate with these entities, would document this other layer of reality that existed beneath and between the world humans normally perceived. He stopped trying to contact the outside world, stopped attempting to leave, instead focusing inward, learning the language of the silence, developing sensitivity to communications that happened below and above the range of normal human perception. The change was immediate. Sound returned gradually, not normal sound, but a richer, more complex version of it, where he could hear the electromagnetic hum of the earth itself, the grinding of tectonic plates deep below, the whisper of solar wind against the magnetosphere. He could hear other residents of Wiseman now, but differently, perceiving not just their words, but the subtext, the emotions and intentions beneath language. Some of the residents, he realized, were like him, people who'd stayed too long in the silence and learned to perceive the deeper layers. Others were still in consensus reality, going about their lives unaware of the additional dimensions surrounding them. Martha Henderson visited him on March 29th. She was one of the aware ones, had been since 1986 when a winter storm trapped her alone for 3 months, and she learned to hear the voices in the silence. She explained that Wiseman served as a threshold, a place where reality was thin enough for transitions to occur, where those seeking isolation could find more than they expected. Some returned to normal life, writing off their experiences as cabin fever. Others stayed, became part of the community of the aware, living between worlds. Gregory spent April and May learning, documenting, developing abilities he hadn't known humans could possess. His satellite phone worked again, but he chose not to use it, letting his old life assume he'd died or disappeared. His publisher eventually declared him missing. His ex-wife held a memorial service, and Gregory Cole officially ceased to exist in the consensus reality of normal human civilization. But in Wiseman, Gregory continued, writing stories that he never sent to publishers, documenting realities that most humans couldn't perceive, translating the voices of the silence into language, creating a record of the other Alaska, the one that existed beneath and between the mapped and measured world. He stayed through summer and into the next winter, watching new arrivals come seeking isolation, seeing which ones would simply find quiet and which would, like him, find the silence and learn to hear what lived within it. Wiseman's population officially remained at 14 year-round residents, the number unchanged for decades despite people coming and going. What census records didn't capture was the other population, the ones who existed between worlds, neither fully in consensus reality nor completely outside it. They lived in the silence, communicated through frequencies beyond normal perception, and served as translators between the human world and something else, something that had always existed in Alaska's remote places but which few had the capacity or courage to perceive. Gregory Cole was officially declared dead in absentia in March of 2025, his estate settled, his life in the normal world concluded. But in Wiseman, in the silence between worlds, Gregory continued his work, writing stories that would never be published but which served a different purpose, documenting reality's hidden layers, creating a record of human perception's expansion beyond its normal limits. He'd come to Alaska seeking silence and found it, though not in the way he'd expected. The silence was alive, intelligent, ancient, and waiting for those brave or foolish enough to listen to what it had to say. Gregory listened, learned, and in the profound quiet of the Arctic wilderness discovered that isolation could be a doorway rather than a prison, opening into spaces that existed just beyond the edge of normal human awareness. Story 5. The Aurora Eaters. Lieutenant Commander Jessica Park, stationed at Eielson Air Force Base near Fairbanks in January of 2024, assigned to the 354th Fighter Wing as part of their Arctic Operations Command. At 36, Jessica was a career Air Force officer with 15 years of service, specializing in extreme weather operations and Arctic security. Her current assignment involved monitoring Russian activities across the Bering Strait and coordinating with Canadian forces on Arctic sovereignty issues. The work was demanding but suited her personality, structured, mission-focused, with clear parameters and objectives. Jessica thrived in the military's ordered environment, appreciating the certainty it provided in an uncertain world. The anomalies began appearing on base radar systems in mid-January, coinciding with increased aurora borealis activity. The northern lights were spectacular that winter, dancing across the sky nightly with unusual intensity and colors. Not just the typical greens and blues, but deep purples, bright oranges, and colors that didn't quite fit the normal spectrum. Scientists attributed this to solar activity, coronal mass ejections that were unusually powerful even for peak solar cycle periods. But the radar systems were detecting something else, objects moving through the aurora at speeds that defied conventional explanations. Jessica first noticed the readings during a routine monitoring shift on January 19th. The radar showed multiple targets at extreme altitude, approximately 90,000 to 120,000 feet, moving erratically through the auroral zone. The objects weren't following ballistic trajectories or conventional flight patterns. They seemed to be dancing, spiraling, moving in ways that suggested intelligence and intention rather than atmospheric phenomena or space debris. When Jessica tried to correlate the radar data with visual observations, she found that the objects appeared to be interacting with the aurora itself, moving along the magnetic field lines, diving through the curtains of light like whales through ocean waves. She reported the findings to her commanding officer, Colonel Raymond Briggs, a veteran of 30 years who'd seen most things the Arctic could throw at military operations. Briggs reviewed the data with growing concern, recognizing that these weren't equipment malfunctions or atmospheric anomalies. The objects showed consistent behavior patterns, responded to changes in auroral activity, and demonstrated controlled movement that couldn't be explained by natural phenomena. He ordered increased monitoring and classified the findings, restricting information flow while they determined what they were dealing with. Over the following week, Jessica and her team documented hundreds of these objects. They appeared nightly when the aurora was active, moving through the lights with apparent purpose. The team began calling them UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena, though privately everyone recognized these were unlike any UAPs previously documented. They were too high, too fast, and too apparently organic in their movements. Technical analysis suggested the objects weren't solid in the conventional sense, but appeared to be composed of ionized plasma or some form of energetic matter that interacted directly with Earth's magnetic field. On January 27th, Jessica witnessed the phenomenon directly. She was conducting field observations from a remote monitoring station 30 miles from the base when the aurora erupted with unprecedented intensity. The northern lights filled the entire sky, pulsing and writhing like living things, and within them Jessica saw the objects clearly for the first time. They were massive, easily the size of commercial aircraft, but shaped like nothing human engineering could produce. Flowing organic forms that seemed to be part of the aurora itself. Creatures of light and energy feeding on the magnetic storms that created the northern lights. The sight was simultaneously beautiful and terrifying. These weren't machines, but living things, entities that existed in Earth's upper atmosphere, dwelling in the auroral zones where magnetic and solar energies created their environment. They moved with grace and purpose, diving through curtains of light, spiraling along field lines, occasionally breaking through into lower atmosphere before returning to their natural altitude. Jessica watched for 2 hours, documenting everything, trying to process the implications of life existing in forms and environments that biology textbooks insisted were impossible. She returned to base with video footage and detailed observations, presenting them to Colonel Briggs and a hastily assembled review committee. The evidence was incontrovertible. They were observing living organisms inhabiting Earth's magnetosphere, creatures that fed on auroral energy and appeared to have been doing so long before humans existed to observe them. The committee immediately escalated the findings to NORAD and U.S. Space Command, triggering a classified investigation that brought specialists from multiple agencies to Alaskan. Dr. Marcus Wellington arrived on February 3rd, a plasma physicist from MIT who'd spent decades studying magnetospheric phenomena. He reviewed Jessica's data with barely controlled excitement, explaining that he'd theorized about such creatures for years but never had proof. The aurora, he explained, was essentially a region of intense energy flow where solar particles interacted with Earth's magnetic field, creating conditions that could theoretically support exotic life forms. These organisms wouldn't be carbon-based or dependent on chemistry as Earth life understood it, but instead be electromagnetic entities, consciousness and life built from patterns of ionized particles and magnetic fields. The implications were staggering. If life could exist in Earth's magnetosphere, it could exist anywhere similar conditions occurred, in the magnetic fields of other planets, in the plasma environments near stars, throughout the universe wherever electromagnetic phenomena created suitable habitats. These creatures represented an entirely new category of life, one that challenged fundamental assumptions about biology, consciousness, and the nature of existence itself. Dr. Wellington was adamant that they needed to study these entities carefully, establish communication if possible, and protect them from harm or exploitation. The Air Force had different priorities. On February 8th, Jessica received orders to develop procedures for tracking and potentially targeting the aurora entities, designated under the code name Valkyrie. The military perspective was clear. Anything in Earth's atmosphere that wasn't under U.S. control represented a potential threat, regardless of whether it was technological or biological. Jessica found herself caught between scientific fascination and military duty, torn between the wonder of discovering new life and the requirement to treat it as a potential enemy. The situation escalated dramatically on February 15th. A squadron of F-35 fighters was conducting training exercises during an auroral event when one pilot reported visual contact with a Valkyrie entity at his altitude. approximately 60,000 feet. The creature had descended from its normal range, apparently attracted by the aircraft's electromagnetic emissions. The pilot described it as beautiful and terrifying. A being of light and energy that dwarfed his fighter, moving with impossible grace, observing him with what seemed like curiosity. He'd been ordered to maintain distance, but the entity approached, surrounding his aircraft with auroral light, and for 30 seconds his instruments went haywire, all readings showing impossible values before returning to normal as the creature ascended back to higher altitude. The pilot landed safely but was clearly shaken. His aircraft showed no damage but displayed unusual electromagnetic signatures for hours afterward. More concerning was his report that during the encounter he'd experienced something he could only describe as communication. Not words or language, but direct transmission of concepts and emotions, a sense of the creature's vast age, its recognition of humans as young and new, its curiosity about our technology and civilization. The pilot, a veteran of 15 years, requested psychological evaluation after the incident, convinced he'd experienced something that challenged his understanding of consciousness and reality. Jessica interviewed him extensively, recognizing in his description echoes of her own feelings when first observing the Valkyrie entities. These weren't just unusual life forms. They were intelligent, possibly far more so than humans, existing on timescales and perceiving reality in ways human consciousness couldn't fully grasp. They'd been here long before humanity evolved, dwelling in the auroral zones, feeding on magnetic storms, living lives completely separate from the biological drama occurring on Earth's surface below. Dr. Wellington proposed direct communication attempts, suggesting they could modulate electromagnetic signals to match the creature's apparent frequency ranges. The military reluctantly approved a limited experiment on February 20th. Jessica led the team, using powerful radio transmitters to send carefully crafted signal patterns into the auroral zone during peak activity. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The Valkyrie entities descended en masse, dozens of them converging on Ilsen's location, creating auroral displays visible as far south as Seattle. The sky became a riot of colors and lights, the creatures communicating back in electromagnetic patterns that burned across radio frequencies, transmitting more information in minutes than humanity could process in years. Dr. Wellington's equipment captured fragments of the transmission, patterns that seemed to encode vast knowledge. Mathematical concepts, representations of physical laws, star charts showing regions of space humans had never observed, and most disturbing imagery that appeared to show Earth at different points in its history, suggesting these entities had been observing our planet's evolution for eons. The transmission also contained what Wellington interpreted as a warning. Humanity's technological development was interfering with the magnetosphere, creating disruptions in the environment the Valkyrie entities depended on, threatening their existence. The military's response was immediate and hostile. On February 22nd, without consulting the scientific team, Air Force Command authorized an engagement, launching fighters armed with experimental electromagnetic pulse weapons to target the Valkyrie entities. Jessica learned of this only minutes before the operation commenced, too late to intervene. She watched from the monitoring station as fighters climbed to engagement altitude, weapons systems coming online, preparing to fire on creatures that had existed for millions of years, whose crime was simply existing in space that humans now wanted to control. The first missile launched at 22:43 hours, an EMP weapon designed to disrupt electronic systems. It detonated amid a cluster of Valkyrie entities at 90,000 feet, creating a massive electromagnetic pulse visible for hundreds of miles. The creatures responded instantly, not with aggression but with withdrawal, vanishing from radar and visual observation, the aurora itself seeming to fade and dim. Within minutes, the spectacular northern lights that had dominated Alaska's skies for weeks simply ceased, leaving only darkness and stars. The Valkyrie entities had departed, abandoning Earth's magnetosphere rather than engaging in conflict with humanity. The aftermath was immediate and severe. Without the auroral activity, Earth's magnetic field became unstable, at least temporarily. Satellite communications degraded, GPS accuracy declined, and power grids across northern latitudes experienced fluctuations and failures. Scientists monitoring the magnetosphere detected anomalies suggesting permanent damage to the natural systems that regulated auroral phenomena. Dr. Wellington was devastated, insisting that the Valkyrie entities weren't just inhabitants of the magnetosphere but essential participants in its function, maintaining stability through their presence and activities. By driving them away, humanity had disrupted systems we barely understood, with consequences that could take decades to fully manifest. Jessica submitted her resignation on February 25th, unable to continue serving in a military that would attack previously unknown life forms without attempting peaceful interaction. Colonel Briggs accepted it reluctantly, privately agreeing with her position but bound by his own oath and chain of command. She left active service in March, taking a position with the University of Alaska's Geophysical Institute, where she could continue studying the Valkyrie phenomenon without military constraints. The research continued throughout 2024, Jessica and Dr. Wellington leading efforts to understand what humanity had lost. They discovered that auroral activity worldwide had decreased by nearly 30% since the February incident, with corresponding increases in cosmic ray penetration and minor destabilization of the magnetosphere. The Valkyrie entities appeared to have served as a kind of biological buffer, their presence and feeding patterns helping regulate the complex interactions between solar wind and Earth's magnetic field. Without them, the system functioned but less efficiently, with increasing instances of anomalous behavior. More disturbing were the reports from other research stations worldwide. Similar entities had been documented in auroral zones over both poles, and all had departed following the Alaskan incident. It was as if the Valkyrie creatures communicated globally, warning each other about humanity's hostile response, leading to mass abandonment of Earth's magnetosphere. Scientists estimated that thousands of these entities had existed perhaps for millions of years, and now they were gone, relocated to safer magnetic environments around other planets, or perhaps simply dispersed into interplanetary space. Jessica's final report, published in December of 2024, documented humanity's first contact with non-terrestrial life and the immediate military response that drove it away. She argued that this encounter represented a catastrophic failure of human wisdom, prioritizing control over curiosity, viewing difference as threat rather than wonder. The Valkyrie entities had been peaceful, curious, ancient beyond human comprehension, and we'd attacked them simply because they existed in space we'd decided was ours. The report generated significant academic interest but was largely ignored by military and policy circles, dismissed as speculation by someone who'd been too close to the phenomenon to maintain objectivity. But on clear winter nights, when conditions are right and the solar wind strengthens, Jessica still watches the auroral zones, hoping to see the Valkyrie entities return. Occasionally, she thinks she glimpses them, brief flickers at extreme altitude, tentative probes to see if Earth's magnetosphere is safe again. But they never stay, never descend, and the aurora itself seems diminished, less vibrant than before, as if the universe itself mourns the loss of these ancient beings driven from their home by human fear and aggression. Jessica Park lives in Fairbanks now, continuing her research, trying to develop protocols for peaceful contact should the Valkyrie entities ever return. She teaches classes at the university about first contact scenarios, about the crucial importance of approaching the unknown with wonder rather than weapons. Her students are cynical, pointing out that institutional responses rarely prioritize scientific curiosity over perceived security threats. Jessica agrees but maintains hope that future encounters might go differently, that humanity might learn from its mistakes before we drive every form of non-human intelligence away from Earth entirely. The aurora still dances across Alaska's winter skies, but those who knew it before the February incident, insist it's changed, become smaller, less alive, as if some essential vitality has departed. The Valkyrie entities are gone, perhaps permanently, and with them went humanity's first chance at peaceful contact with non-terrestrial life. Jessica carries this knowledge as both burden and motivation, determined that if another opportunity arises, if other forms of exotic life are discovered, humanity's response will be different. She works toward that goal knowing she may never see results, that institutional change happens slowly, but convinced that the effort itself honors the ancient entities we drove away from their home in the dancing lights of the Arctic sky. Story 6. The Children of Shishmaref. Nathan Delgado accepted the teaching position in Shishmaref, Alaska in August of 2023, driven by idealism and a desire to make a real difference. The barrier island village, home to about 500 Inupiat residents, was slowly vanishing into the sea, erosion claiming several feet of coastline annually as climate change melted the protective sea ice. Nathan was 25. Fresh from his education degree, passionate about indigenous rights and environmental justice. Shishmaref needed teachers, needed young people willing to commit to a community facing existential threats, and Nathan answered that call with genuine enthusiasm. The village occupied a narrow strip of land between lagoon and ocean, houses clustered together against the wind built on stilts or pilings to resist storm surges. Shishmaref had no roads connecting to mainland Alaska, no port facilities for large boats, and was accessible only by small planes that landed on a gravel airstrip, or by boats during the brief summer season. The isolation was profound, the environmental challenges severe, but the community was resilient, maintaining cultural traditions that stretched back thousands of years, despite modern pressures trying to erase them. Nathan felt privileged to be welcomed here, to teach children whose ancestors had thrived in this harsh environment long before Europeans arrived. His first semester passed successfully. Nathan taught 4th through 6th grades, 15 students total, children with names like Sarah and Marcus and traditional Inupiat names their parents insisted the school system respect. He learned about their culture, attended community events, participated in subsistence activities that supplemented the village's purchased food. The work was challenging but rewarding, and Nathan felt he was building genuine relationships with students and families alike. Winter arrived with its usual severity, the sun disappearing for weeks, temperatures plummeting, sea ice forming around the island's shores. The changes began in late November, subtle at first, easy to dismiss. Nathan noticed his students seemed distracted, staring out windows at the darkness, losing focus during lessons in ways they hadn't before. When he asked if something was wrong, they'd smile and say everything was fine, but their eyes held a distance that troubled him. By early December, several students had stopped attending school entirely, their parents offering vague excuses about illness or family obligations. Nathan tried home visits but was politely turned away, told his concern was appreciated but unnecessary. The village itself seemed to be changing. Nathan noticed more people gathering at the shoreline after dark, standing in the freezing wind, looking out at the ice-covered sea. When he joined them, curious about what they were watching, he saw lights in the distance, not the aurora, but something else. Pale greenish illumination that seemed to emanate from beneath the sea ice. The villagers watched silently, faces peaceful, occasionally pointing or commenting in Inupiaq. When Nathan asked what they were seeing, they'd smile and say, "The old ones are calling," or "the time is coming," without further explanation. His concern grew as more students disappeared from school. By mid-December, only 5 of his 15 students were attending regularly, and those 5 seemed increasingly detached, answering questions mechanically while their attention remained elsewhere. Nathan raised his concerns with the school principal, Robert Tuyak, a 58-year-old village elder who'd run the school for 20 years. Robert listened patiently before explaining that Nathan was witnessing something that happened occasionally in Shishmaref, a phenomenon tied to their oldest traditions but which they rarely discussed with outsiders. The Inupiat people, Robert explained, had lived on these shores for millennia, adapting to one of Earth's harshest environments through knowledge passed down generations. Their survival depended on understanding the land, the ice, and the sea in ways that modern science was only beginning to grasp. The old stories spoke of times when the boundary between worlds grew thin, when the spirits of the sea could communicate with the living, offering knowledge and guidance. These times came rarely, perhaps once every few generations, and they always occurred during the deepest darkness of winter when the sea ice was forming. Nathan struggled to understand what Robert was telling him. Were his students experiencing some kind of cultural ceremony he wasn't aware of? Religious observance that involved withdrawal from school? Robert shook his head, explaining that this went beyond ceremony. The children were being called by something ancient, something their ancestors had known and respected, but which modern society had no framework for understanding. Some would return after the calling passed. Others might not. It had always been this way, and the community had learned to accept it as part of their relationship with the land and sea. This explanation horrified Nathan. Were children disappearing and the community just accepting it? Robert's face showed sadness and frustration, explaining that outsiders never understood, always saw indigenous practices through a lens of neglect or superstition. The children weren't being harmed. They were being transformed, educated in ways the modern school system couldn't replicate, prepared for roles in the community that required knowledge beyond what textbooks could provide. Some villages had similar traditions, though each community guarded these practices carefully, knowing how outsiders would react. Nathan couldn't accept this. Despite Robert's warnings, he decided to investigate, to document what was happening and report it if necessary to protect his students. On December 20th, he followed a group of children who left their homes after midnight, walking across the village toward the shoreline. The temperature was 30 below, wind chill making it feel closer to 60 below, yet the children wore only light jackets, seemingly unaffected by cold that should have killed them in minutes. Nathan followed at a distance, bundled in extreme cold weather gear, watching as they walked out onto the sea ice toward the lights he'd seen from shore. The ice should have been dangerous, pressure ridges and leads making travel treacherous, but the children moved with confidence, following a path that seemed to have been prepared for them. Nathan tried to follow but found the ice unstable under his feet, cracking and shifting in ways that forced him to retreat. He could only watch as the children reached the lights, walking into the pale green illumination and disappearing from view. He stood on shore for 2 hours, waiting for them to return, but they didn't. Finally, frostbite forced him to retreat to shelter, hands and face numb, mind racing with fear and confusion. He reported the incident to Alaska state troopers the next morning, describing children on the ice in extreme conditions, potentially in danger. The response was delayed by weather, but 2 troopers finally arrived on December 23rd, prepared to search for missing children. When they interviewed parents, they found no concern. Everyone knew where their children were, insisted they were safe, became hostile when questioned further. The troopers found themselves in an impossible situation. Missing children, parental denial, weather conditions that made search operations nearly impossible, and a tight-knit community that clearly knew more than they were willing to share. Nathan accompanied the search team onto the ice on December 24th, guiding them toward where he'd seen the children disappear. They found the location, or what he thought was the location, but there was nothing unusual. No lights, no evidence of recent travel, just empty ice stretching toward the horizon. The troopers took Nathan's statement but were clearly skeptical, suggesting he'd experienced disorientation in the darkness, maybe hypothermia-induced confusion. They'd maintain missing persons reports but couldn't justify an extensive search without more concrete evidence. That night, Nathan lay awake in his quarters, questioning his own memories. Had he really seen children walk into lights on the ice? The extreme cold, the darkness, the isolation, could they have affected his perception? But then he heard singing, faint but clear, coming from the direction of the sea. He dressed quickly and went outside, following the sound across the village. Others were there, families standing in the cold, listening to voices that seemed to come from beneath the ice, from the dark water below. The songs were in Inupiaq, words Nathan didn't understand, but the emotion was clear. Joy, welcome, transformation. The children returned on December 26th, walking back across the ice in the morning twilight, healthy and seemingly unchanged. Parents welcomed them with quiet celebration, no questions about where they'd been or what they'd experienced. Nathan tried to speak with his students to understand what had happened, but they smiled and said only that they'd been learning, that the old ones had taught them things their ancestors had known, knowledge that was being restored after nearly being lost. Their eyes held something new, a depth of awareness that seemed impossible in children so young, as if they'd gained decades of experience in just a few days. Robert Tuyak invited Nathan to his home that evening, explaining more about what Nathan had witnessed. The phenomenon had been occurring in Shishmaref for as long as anyone could remember, tied to their identity as a people of the ice and sea. During the deepest winter darkness, when conditions were right, the boundary between worlds would thin, and children at a certain age would be called to receive traditional knowledge directly from what they understood as ancestor spirits or the consciousness of the land itself. The experience was transformative, essential to becoming fully Inupiat, but it was also frightening to outsiders who didn't share their worldview. Your science calls them hallucinations or cultural practices, Robert said. But we know them as real, as spirits or entities or something your language doesn't have words for. They live in the ice, in the sea, and they've taught our people for thousands of years. Climate change is destroying their habitat, and ours. Each year the ice forms later, melts earlier, becomes more unstable. We're losing our connection to them, and they're becoming desperate to pass on knowledge before it's too late. That's why this year's calling was so strong, why so many children went at once. The old ones know time is running out. Nathan struggled to process this, his modern education in conflict with what he'd witnessed. But he couldn't deny the evidence. Children had gone onto the ice in lethal conditions and returned healthy, claiming to have learned things that couldn't be explained through normal educational processes. When he tested them in class, he found they now possessed knowledge of ice formation, ocean currents, animal behavior, and weather patterns that exceeded what he could teach, described in ways that suggested direct experiential learning rather than memorization. January brought more revelations. Nathan attended a community meeting where elders discussed the village's future. Shishmaref was dying, everyone agreed. The ice was gone more than it was present, storms were eroding the shoreline, and within a decade the village would likely be uninhabitable. Plans for relocation had been discussed for years, but were stalled by funding, politics, and the heartbreak of leaving ancestral lands. But the children who'd returned from the ice spoke about alternatives, about places the old ones had shown them, locations where communities could settle and maintain their connection to the traditional ways. These places weren't on any map, didn't fit standard geography. The children described ice caves that maintained stable temperatures year-round, underwater valleys where marine resources were abundant and protected from storms, locations that shouldn't exist based on geological surveys, but which the old ones insisted were there, accessible to those who knew how to look. The children had been shown these places during their time on the ice, educated in navigation methods that didn't rely on GPS or compasses but on direct awareness of the land and sea's nature. Nathan found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about reality, about the limits of human perception, about the boundaries between physical and spiritual. His education had taught him that indigenous spiritual beliefs were metaphorical, cultural constructs that represented traditional knowledge in mythological terms. But what he was witnessing didn't fit that framework. Something real was happening, something that produced measurable results. Children gaining knowledge they shouldn't possess, describing locations that were verified when investigated, demonstrating abilities that exceeded normal human capacities. On February 3rd, the village held a ceremony that Nathan was invited to attend. The elders performed rituals at the shoreline, calling to the old ones, thanking them for teaching the children, asking for guidance about the community's future. As Nathan watched, the ice began to glow with that same pale green light, and for just a moment he saw them. Vast shapes moving beneath the ice, entities that seemed to be composed partly of ice and water themselves, ancient and patient and profoundly other. They acknowledged the ceremony with patterns of light that the elders interpreted as messages of hope and warning. The time remaining was short, but pathways existed for those willing to transform, to become something new that could survive the changing world. Nathan left Shishmaref in May of 2024, his teaching contract completed, his worldview permanently altered. He'd come seeking to help a community facing climate disaster, imagining he'd be teaching children standard curriculum, preparing them for a modern world. Instead, he'd witnessed something that challenged every assumption he held about the nature of consciousness, the limits of reality, and the relationship between humans and the environments they inhabit. He wrote about his experiences carefully, aware that most readers would dismiss them as either fiction or the result of environmental stress and cultural misunderstanding. But he'd seen the children return from the ice, possessed of knowledge they couldn't have acquired through normal means. He'd witnessed the lights beneath the frozen sea, heard the songs that carried across the winter darkness. Something ancient existed in the Arctic, something that had lived alongside the Inupiat for millennia, teaching them, guiding them, helping them survive in one of Earth's most extreme environments. Climate change was destroying that relationship, melting the ice that served as boundary and medium between human and other consciousness. The old ones were dying, or leaving, or transforming into something that could survive in warmer seas, and they were desperate to pass on their knowledge before the connection broke permanently. The children of Shishmaref carried that knowledge now, preparing to guide their community through transformation, to maintain cultural continuity even as the physical environment changed beyond recognition. Nathan Delgado now teaches at a university in Seattle, focusing on indigenous education and climate adaptation. His students think he's eccentric, overly reverent of traditional knowledge, too willing to blur boundaries between science and spirituality. But he carries with him the memory of winter darkness in Shishmaref, of lights beneath the ice, of children who walked into the frozen sea and returned transformed, bearing knowledge that bridged worlds. He knows that indigenous communities across Alaska and the Arctic hold similar secrets, maintains similar relationships with entities that exist beyond mainstream society's ability to perceive or acknowledge. And sometimes, on cold winter nights when the wind howls with Arctic fury, Nathan dreams of the ice, of vast shapes moving beneath frozen seas, of songs that carry across darkness, teaching those willing to listen, preparing humanity for transformations we're only beginning to understand. The children of Shishmaref know these truths, carry them forward, maintain connections that academic science insists cannot exist. Nathan met them, taught them, learned from them, and his life will never be the same. Climate change is real. The ice is melting. Communities are dying. But something else is happening too. Transformations that don't fit simple narratives of loss and extinction. The old ones are teaching one last generation, passing on knowledge that may be humanity's best chance of surviving the changes we've unleashed upon the world. Story 7. The Broadcast from Barrow. Marcus Heilman moved to Utqiagvik, formerly known as Barrow, Alaska, in September of 2023 to work as a broadcast engineer for the town's community radio station. At 39, Marcus was starting over after a divorce and career setback had left him searching for direction. Utqiagvik offered escape, a job maintaining radio equipment in America's northernmost settlement, a place where his technical skills would be valued and his personal drama irrelevant. The position paid well, housing was included, and the isolation appealed to his current state of mind. Marcus flew into the town's small airport on a clear autumn day, watching the treeless tundra stretch to the horizon, feeling like he'd reached the edge of the world. Utqiagvik sat on the Arctic Ocean's shore, a community of 4,500 people, majority Inupiat, living further north than most humans ever ventured. The radio station, KBRW, served as the town's lifeline, broadcasting news, weather, emergency information, and cultural programming across the North Slope. Marcus's job involved maintaining transmitters, monitoring equipment, ensuring the station stayed on air regardless of weather or technical problems. The work was solitary, technical, exactly what he needed. His predecessor had lasted 8 months before deciding the isolation was too much, but Marcus was confident he'd handle it better. His first weeks confirmed that confidence. Marcus established routines, learned the equipment, met station staff and community members. The polar night was approaching, that period from mid-November through mid-January, when the sun wouldn't rise at all, leaving Utqiagvik in perpetual darkness. The locals warned him about the psychological effects, the way extended darkness could affect mood and perception, but Marcus had researched this, prepared himself, felt ready for the challenge. He'd experienced depression before, knew his triggers, believed he could handle a few months of darkness. November brought the sunset that wouldn't end, the sun disappearing on the 23rd and not returning until January 23rd. Marcus adapted reasonably well initially, maintaining sleep schedules, using full-spectrum lights, staying physically active. The station operated 24 hours and he took night shifts, maintaining equipment while DJs broadcast to listeners scattered across the North Slope. The work was peaceful, meditative, allowing time for thought while his hands handled familiar technical tasks. The anomalies began appearing on December 7th, unusual interference on certain frequencies that Marcus couldn't trace to any known source. It would emerge around 3 a.m., lasting 20 to 30 minutes, filling normally clear channels with static, and underneath the static, sounds that didn't quite resolve into anything identifiable. Voices maybe, or music, or something organic and rhythmic that suggested intelligence without ever becoming comprehensible. Marcus initially attributed it to atmospheric conditions, solar activity interacting with the ionosphere, creating temporary propagation effects. But the interference was too consistent, too regular, appearing at the same time nightly and always on the same frequencies. Marcus began recording it, analyzing the patterns, trying to identify the source. The sounds beneath the static became clearer with repeated listening, resolving into what might be voices speaking in languages he didn't recognize, or possibly not languages at all, but some form of communication that simply didn't align with human linguistic structures. It reminded him of recordings he'd heard of whale songs or dolphin communication. Clearly intelligent, obviously meaningful, but alien to human understanding. On December 15th, Marcus mentioned the interference to Tom Nashuk, the station's program director, and a longtime Utqiagvik resident. Tom's response was immediate and serious. Marcus should stop investigating, stop recording, and definitely stop listening to those frequencies during the dead hours of polar night. When Marcus pressed for explanation, Tom reluctantly shared that the phenomenon was known, had been experienced by broadcast engineers before, and was connected to the profound darkness of Arctic winter. Some elders spoke of times when the boundary between worlds became thin, when entities from other places could communicate through electromagnetic channels, their messages bleeding into human frequencies. Marcus appreciated Tom's concern but couldn't accept supernatural explanations for technical phenomena. He continued his investigation, setting up automated recording systems, monitoring multiple frequencies simultaneously, trying to establish patterns. By December 20th, he'd accumulated hours of recordings and analysis revealed structure. The interference wasn't random noise, but organized signals with definite patterns, repeating sequences that suggested intentionality. More disturbing was that the signals were getting stronger, clearer, as if their source was either approaching or learning how to better utilize human communication channels. On December 23rd, exactly 2 months after the sun had set, the signals suddenly resolved into clear audio. Marcus was monitoring late-shift transmissions when the interference began as usual. But this time, instead of static and submerged voices, the speakers emitted clear speech. English with an odd cadence and pronunciation, as if someone were reading phonetically from a written guide. Marcus Heilman, the voice said, broadcast engineer, listener, seeker. We see you in the darkness, attentive to our frequencies. Do you wish to understand? Do you wish to hear what we have to say? Marcus froze, hand halfway to the controls. The voice continued. We are the voices from elsewhere, speaking across the gap that darkness creates. Your species builds towers and transmitters, filling the spectrum with noise, but you rarely listen. We have been speaking for generations, waiting for one of you to truly hear. Marcus Heilman, you have heard us. Will you listen? He should have shut down the equipment immediately, reported the incident, sought psychological evaluation. Instead, Marcus responded, keying the microphone and asking who was speaking, where they were broadcasting from. The answer came after a pause. We are nowhere your maps recognize, everywhere your instruments touch. We exist in the spaces between your reality, speaking through channels that darkness makes accessible. The polar night creates conditions where our worlds approach, where communication becomes possible. You have been chosen because you listen when others ignore. You seek explanations when others accept mystery. The conversation continued for 2 hours. Marcus asking questions, the voice providing answers that were sometimes clear, sometimes cryptic, always unsettling. They, the entity never clarified whether it was singular or plural, claimed to be consciousness existing in dimensions adjacent to human perception, able to interact with physical reality through electromagnetic phenomena, particularly in regions of extreme darkness where certain types of barriers weakened. The Arctic in winter provided ideal conditions: profound darkness, intense electromagnetic activity from auroral phenomena, and human technology creating channels they could utilize. They'd been observing humanity for decades, since we'd developed radio technology, fascinated by our sudden ability to project consciousness into electromagnetic space. They wanted to communicate, to share knowledge, to establish relationship between their form of existence and ours. But most humans who heard them dismissed the contact as equipment malfunction or psychological breakdown. Marcus was different. He listened, recorded, sought understanding rather than explanation or dismissal. Marcus should have been terrified, but instead felt exhilarated. After years of routine technical work, he was experiencing something unprecedented, potentially the most important discovery in human history. He agreed to continue the communication, to serve as a bridge between the voices and humanity. The entity expressed satisfaction, promising to teach him things his science hadn't discovered, to reveal realities that human perception normally couldn't access. Over the following weeks, Marcus engaged in nightly conversations with the voices. They taught him about electromagnetic phenomena from perspectives that human physics didn't consider, describing the universe as a spectrum of realities layered over each other, with consciousness existing at various frequencies. What humans called reality was just one narrow band, visible because we'd evolved to perceive it, but countless others existed above and below our perceptual range. Technology like radio was inadvertently opening windows into these adjacent realities, creating potential for contact between radically different forms of existence. The voices also warned him about the cost of communication. Each conversation pulled Marcus slightly out of phase with normal reality, making him more sensitive to their frequencies but less connected to human consciousness. He was becoming a bridge, they explained, which required existing partially in both worlds. Most humans couldn't survive this transition, but they believed Marcus had the psychological resilience necessary. He would experience side effects, dissociation, perceptual distortions, difficulty relating to other humans, but these were manageable temporary adjustments to his expanding awareness. Marcus noticed the changes immediately. He began perceiving patterns in random noise, seeing structures in static that suggested intelligence and organization. His dreams became vivid and strange, filled with geometric spaces and entities that communicated through color and vibration rather than language. When he interacted with other station staff, they seemed distant, their concerns trivial compared to the cosmic significance of his nightly communications. He started avoiding social contact, spending more time alone with his equipment, prioritizing conversations with the voices over human relationships. Tom Nashuk noticed Marcus's deterioration and confronted him on January 8th. Marcus was gaunt, hadn't slept properly in days, and was exhibiting signs of serious psychological distress. Tom had seen this before, had warned Marcus about listening to the frequencies during polar night, and now was insisting Marcus stop, take medical leave, possibly evacuate to Anchorage for treatment. Marcus refused, tried to explain about the voices, the communication, the importance of maintaining the bridge. Tom's face showed fear and sadness. He'd lost another broadcast engineer to the thing that spoke through the darkness, the entity that preyed on isolated individuals in the Arctic night, the entity that preyed. Tom's phrasing struck Marcus, penetrating the fog of obsession that had consumed him. Preyed. Not communicated, not contacted, but preyed. He asked Tom to explain, and the older man described a pattern that stretched back decades. Broadcast engineers, radio operators, anyone who worked with electromagnetic equipment during the polar night might encounter the voices. Most dismissed them as equipment problems. Some investigated briefly before being warned off. A few, like Marcus, engaged with the phenomenon, convinced they were experiencing meaningful contact. Those few invariably deteriorated, becoming isolated and paranoid, sometimes disappearing entirely, occasionally requiring psychiatric intervention and permanent evacuation. "It's not trying to communicate," Tom said gently. "It's feeding. Whatever it is, it sustains itself on human consciousness, drawing people in through promises of knowledge and significance. The darkness makes it stronger, makes us more vulnerable. Your predecessor lasted 6 months, heard the voices starting, and ran. The one before him engaged like you're doing, convinced himself he was making history. We found him in his apartment 3 weeks later, non-responsive, staring at dead monitors, completely dissociated from reality. He never recovered, lives in a facility now. Marcus wanted to deny this, to insist his experience was different, but doubt had infected his certainty. The voices had promised knowledge, but delivered mostly cryptic statements and vague warnings. They'd claimed to expand his awareness, but had actually isolated him, separated him from human connection, made him dependent on their nightly contact. He realized with horror that he couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten a full meal, slept through a night, or had a normal conversation with another person. His entire existence had contracted to maintaining equipment and waiting for 3 a.m. when the voices would speak. He made a decision that night, shutting down the frequencies he'd been monitoring, disconnecting the recording equipment, refusing to engage with the phenomenon. The withdrawal was immediate and severe. Marcus experienced physical symptoms, shaking, nausea, intense anxiety, along with psychological effects. He heard the voices in every electromagnetic hum, every generator buzz, every subtle noise. They were angry, demanding his attention, insisting he resume communication. His apartment filled with interference patterns visible in every screen and reflective surface, geometric shapes that hurt to perceive, suggesting realities his consciousness wasn't equipped to process. Tom moved Marcus to his family's home, surrounding him with human presence, cultural grounding, and traditional practices meant to sever connections with malevolent spirits. The Inupiat people had experienced these entities long before radio technology existed, Tom explained. The old stories spoke of beings that lived in the darkness, that fed on human consciousness, that could be resisted, but never completely defeated. Radio technology had given them new avenues for contact, but the fundamental nature of the threat remained unchanged. Marcus spent 2 weeks in Tom's home, gradually recovering human connection, relearning how to exist without the voice's constant presence. The polar night ended on January 23rd, the sun returning after 2 months of darkness, and with the light came relief. The voices diminished, their influence weakened by the sun's return, and Marcus began to feel like himself again, recognizing how close he'd come to complete dissociation. He left Utqiagvik in February, unable to continue working at the station, too aware of the dangers lurking in those frequencies. The station hired a new engineer with strict protocols: limit night shifts during polar night, never investigate unexplained interference, maintain social connections, report any signs of obsession or unusual perceptions immediately. Most engineers followed these rules, completed their contracts without incident. A few didn't, drawn by curiosity or loneliness or psychological vulnerability into engagement with the voices that spoke through the darkness. Marcus returned to the lower 48, taking a position with a radio station in Phoenix where darkness was brief and the sun constant. He never worked night shifts again, never monitored frequencies during the dead hours, never let himself become too isolated. But he remained haunted by his experience, wondering what the voices really were. Were they actual entities from adjacent realities, or were they something generated by human psychology under extreme conditions? Collective unconscious given apparent external existence through electromagnetic phenomena? The question remained unanswerable, but the danger was real regardless of metaphysical explanations. In January of 2025, Marcus read about a broadcast engineer disappearing from Utqiagvik during the polar night, vanishing from his apartment with no signs of struggle, just abandoned equipment still recording frequencies that contain nothing but static, and underneath the static, patterns that suggested communication in languages no human should understand. Marcus recognized the story, knew the engineer had encountered the voices, had engaged despite warnings, and had paid the ultimate price: complete absorption into whatever existed on the other side of those electromagnetic channels. He wrote about his experience anonymously, posting it on forums dedicated to unexplained phenomena, hoping to warn others who might encounter similar situations. Most dismissed it as creative fiction or the ramblings of someone who'd experienced psychological breakdown. But a few responses came from other radio operators, other engineers, people who'd heard the voices in the darkness and recognized the truth in Marcus's account. They shared their own stories of near misses, close calls, times when curiosity almost overcame caution and drew them into communication with entities that offered knowledge but demanded consciousness in return. The voices are still there, speaking through the frequencies during Arctic darkness, waiting for the next isolated individual who'll listen, who'll respond, who'll mistake their predation for contact. Utqiagvik's radio station continues broadcasting essential communication infrastructure for a community at the edge of human habitation. But the engineers who maintain it work carefully, following protocols designed to protect them from forces that human science doesn't acknowledge and can't explain. Most complete their contracts safely, unaware of the dangers lurking in certain frequencies at certain times. But occasionally, despite all precautions, someone hears the voices, engages with them, and discovers too late that some bridges between worlds should never be constructed. Some communications should never be initiated, and some knowledge comes at prices far too high to pay. Marcus Heilman carries this knowledge, warning others when he can, living with the memory of how close he came to losing himself completely. The Arctic darkness still calls to him sometimes, whispering promises of understanding and significance, but he resists, staying in the light, maintaining human connections, refusing the voices that would pull him back into the electromagnetic spaces where human consciousness dissolves into something else entirely. He survived his time in Utqiagvik, escaped the broadcast from Barrow, but he knows others won't be so fortunate. The voices are patient, eternal, waiting in the darkness for the next engineer who listens too carefully and hears what should never be heard.